Hey, what's happening? This is the Business of Fun podcast. I am your host, Dave Wakeman. Thank you for listening. Thank you. My guest today is a repeat guest, Brian Hess, and he is here to talk about sports washing. Last time we talked, we had a little bit of a passion project because we were talking about the proposed arena in Northern Virginia that was going to take the Capitals and the Wizards from downtown D.C. to Northern Virginia. That project went bust. But Brian needed to come back and talk about sports washing because that was kind of one of the things that we touched on briefly in our first podcast. And when I say need, it was because it was something I wanted to talk about. But before I talk about this conversation with Brian, let me go through a few things with you before we get going. This is July 8th. So I just got back from London. It was amazing. I haven't even been there yet, and I'm telling you it was great. But that means I'm turning my attention now to the Fans for Life workshop, which is taking place on September 4th, 2024 in New York City. Brand new reinvented workshop for 2024. We're going to focus on strategy and branding and marketing and sales, renewals, prospecting. We're going to pack as much as we can into one day so that you and your team have the ability to sell even more tickets in 2024 and 2025. The link is in the show notes. It's going to be a great day together. Lately, I've been getting a lot more new signups for the Talking Tickets newsletter. If you aren't signed up, I don't know why you aren't, and I hope you will sign up now. You can find it at talkingtickets.substack.com. It's a great resource, if I do say so myself. My website is www.davewakeman.com, and there's always something new going on there. But mainly, send me your thoughts and your questions, your ideas and your concerns, because that helps guide the podcast and the newsletter. And you can do that by sending me an email, dave@davewakeman.com. Now back to my conversation a second time with Brian Hess about sports watching. We talk about a whole lot because I think I was even a little bit confused about how insidious sports washing was in American sports. I was familiar with the way that sports washing had been presented and talked about in international soccer through the acquisitions of Man City, PSG, and Newcastle. But Brian lays it out looking at the PGA Tour and the Live Golf Tournament through the investments in monumental sports and entertainment. Brian lays out some of the implications, like how it can be used to influence government and policy decisions. He talks about, and what could happen if sports washing happened in the NFL. He could talk about election engineering. He talks about like congressional influence that takes place. He talks about the need for more transparency in rulemaking and sports. He talks about the use of loopholes. This was something I wasn't as well versed on as I maybe thought I was initially. So this is a pretty interesting conversation with Brian Hess on the Business of Fun. All right, I'm going to welcome back Brian Hess to the Business of Fun. Brian today, though, last time he had on a suit and tie, and that was pretty amazing. Today he has on like a jersey, so I think we're going to talk about some different stuff. Brian, how are you?
Doing well, Dave. Thanks for having me back.
Of course.
I had a lot of fun last time.
This is going to be more fun because this is like something I've had a chance to prepare for more than like I was last time I got to put about as much effort as the state of Virginia and Monumental did into the planning of their arena. I put into the podcast. So this is something better because I had a little bit more knowledge about this topic and a little bit more time to prepare. So sports washing is what we're going to talk about today. And I want to start with just a definition of sports washing because I know that the term gets thrown around a lot. I also am really a big proponent of making sure we define what we're discussing so people understand the angle that we're using. So can you give me a definition of sports washing so I know where you're coming from?
Yes, generally speaking, we're talking about sports washing when it's a foreign regime with bad human rights records, authoritarian governments, using sports to wash over its reputation with Western audiences. So you see this when foreign nations will acquire teams, or they will invest heavily in infrastructure to bring a sporting event to their country, all with the intent to make their reputation look good, encourage tourism, and make people forget about the atrocities that they commit. But we are starting to see this happen more and more into America and the acquisition of Western properties. And then we're starting to see the next phase of that, which is using that reputational gain to influence American politics and policymaking.
All right. So you say that it's starting in the West now. And my question to you is like, this isn't a new topic to me. So when you say the West, to me, it's been going on for a long time in the West, because I consider PSG, and that project has been, one that has had that label applied to it. Man City, most recently Newcastle United. Those things seem to have been going on for a while. So why do you say it's just starting now? Are you breaking the U.S. apart from the rest of the West, or is there a specific reason for that?
Yeah, I would say it's accelerating across the West, both Europe and America. But in America, we're starting to see it happen more and more, and it's coming onto our shores. And the way that we kind of got turned on by this was you look at PGA and Live, right? The golf. Live was supposed to come up, be this big competitive bulwark against the PGA, but it was backed by Saudi Arabia, and then they merged with PGA because shortly after they announced, and then we see it with Professional Fighters League. Saudi Arabia invested $100 million into the Professional Fighters League, a competitor to the UFC. And then shortly after that, they acquired Bellator, which was another MMA circuit owned by Paramount at the time, in order to continue trying to compete with the UFC. And then we saw what all of that came to fruition, which was the arena in Alexandria, which we talked about not too long ago, when the original investors in PFL, Governor Glenn Youngkin, Ted Leonsis, benefited directly from the Saudi Arabian investment into the Professional Fighters League, and then they're now trying to use taxpayer dollars to build an arena that would, by their own business plan, host combat events.
So, all right, so I follow this, but the one question I have is, and I think this comes out of my belief in the power of competition, why isn't this competition good? Because, the examples you give me is like, a competitor to the PGA with Live, the PFL and Bellator with combat sports are a competitor to the UFC. Why isn't this a win for people? Why is this a bad thing?
I mean, competition is always good. Sports Fans Coalition is constantly trying to encourage competition in all elements of the sports ecosystem, from media to ticketing to sports betting. Competition is good for fans. The problem is when you start creating these investor cliques that involve Saudi Arabia and government officials and other wealthy individuals who have influence over American politics, you end up blurring the lines between what's good for the American people and what's good for foreign interests when it comes to things like stadium financing or other political agendas that might come up.
Okay. I mean, that makes a little bit more sense, because one of the things that seems to be at play here, or I guess makes it this part of the thing of coming to America, like accelerating in the States is the way you described it, is how in this regard, it seems like investment from Saudi Arabia, investment from some of these other they're really oil-rich countries most of the time, has accelerated in the States. At the same time, America and a lot of countries around the world are pulling back from allowing investments. And so if I'm not misreading you, you're telling me that like it's as a government, we're not, and people, we're cool with foreign investment as long as it's the right kind of foreign investment, which usually means paying off the politicians and the people involved. And that is that kind of at the heart of some of this, or am I missing something?
I think it's about who we're getting in bed with, right? In the case of Saudi Arabia, the public investment fund is run by a man named Yasir Al-Ramayan. And he has been targeted by Senator Blumenthal on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations as one of the key figures in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He has been a key financier for the Crown and has been directly involved in a lot of the human rights abuses that Saudi Arabia gets accused of. Mm-hmm. When we allow sports washing in Saudi Arabia to invest in American sports like this, we are bringing in that camel's nose under the tent, so to speak.
Okay.
We're letting them in, and that's going to influence how we interact with Middle East policy, but also how we interact with the politics on the local level. You saw how the fans felt about this when DC United fans started protesting their own team because DC United traveled to Saudi Arabia. They're not okay with the team being involved with the Saudis. And Washington Post not too long ago did a poll in which they found that the majority of Americans would not want a foreign nation like Saudi Arabia, China, Qatar, any of them that have human rights abuses on their records, investing in their local teams. We don't want them, but they don't want those kinds of regimes having influence over American fandom.
Yeah. And I get that. And I think there's two parts to this. So the cat's already out of the bag, even with allowing investment into our teams, right? Because you gave me live and you gave me the combat sports, but there's tennis, right? Which is and I'm not even going mainstream just yet. But then there's also the NHL and the NBA because the Qatar government or the Qatar investment fund, didn't they invest in Monumental?
Yes. They have they have a stake in Monumental Sports. They invested in June of last year. And what sounds the alarm for me on that is June of last year is about the same time that Monumental and the Commonwealth of Virginia started negotiating on their stadium subsidy. And that would have been a material fact that would have influenced the Qatar's investment fund's decision to invest. So what did they know and when?
Right. Yeah, I'm one of those kind of people who is like, if something doesn't seem right, it probably isn't.
Yep.
But call me skeptical. I guess like part of the thing too, that when I'm thinking through this idea, right? Because I understand it, and I know that it's at least to me, it's not something that's done willy-nilly. Like this is a pretty well thought out strategy that seems to have been happening over the years. Do you think it's been something that's been successful, or it continues to be successful? Is it gaining steam at being successful, or is it just like throwing good money after bad?
I think it's a great question for the investment fund and of these nations. They wouldn't do it if it weren't successful, if they weren't getting something out of it. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it's a key pillar of their Vision 2030 plan, which is largely designed to boost tourism as a way to counterbalance the loss of fossil fuel income as the world moves towards things like solar, wind, and not relying on fossil fuels. They want to diversify their economy that way. So it seems to be working, but it's also currying them favor with foreign governments that might not have a direct ROI, if you look at their balance sheet, but it definitely has some intangible benefits, especially in the long run.
Well, let me ask you this then, because, they're talking about economic diversification, Project 2030, getting a return on that investment. Would the opposite side of this be like, isn't that a good thing that they're opening themselves up to the world? Or has it really worked the other way where it's like, the world's just become a little bit more immune to the human rights issues? Don't they tell me the Washington Post says what is it? Democracy dies in darkness, right. And sunlight will help everything, so I know that people would tell me oh, maybe isn't that a good idea?
Yeah. So I would say it's one thing if they're opening their borders up to allow for American sports to compete abroad. And you see this very commonly with MMA, right? The leagues will go to Saudi Arabia for a match, or the Formula One Grand Prix, of which they're building a whole new circuit right now in order to have two Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia now on the calendar. All of that might seem fine. Saudi Arabia has started to make progress when it comes to things like women's rights. Just a couple years ago, women can finally drive cars. Women are starting to be allowed to compete in athletics. All of that is good and progress. The fear is when it comes to the other way. That by them investing in American properties and American sports, that the influence that they are going to be able to leverage is going to have a direct harm on taxpayers and our foreign policy.
Okay, that I seem to understand a little bit more because, even if you're making progress, progress doesn't happen in a straight line, I think is the easiest way to say this. And, to me, I think the concern would be, you give a little bit, right? Like everybody gets a little bit, but then it shuts off real progress, right? It's like, oh yeah, we'll let women, the women play sports and we'll let them drive. And then at the same time, it kind of, and maybe I'm reaching, because that's completely possible. At the same time, we see it seems like it might make it a little more palatable for the turn back of some rights here in the States, even because you're like going, oh, well, it works fine in Saudi Arabia. It works fine in some of these other countries. Why have we given people all these rights and all these things here? And maybe I'm reaching.
Yeah. If we're measuring the bar of success by it works fine in Saudi Arabia, we have reached an all-time low. So,
listen, I there's crazy things that I see happening today that I would have never believed were happening. So
fair. The concern is that, when they come over, and Saudi Arabia hosts an event here in the States or through PFL, and you get wealthy investors and local politicians to come to the boxes of those events, which is an all too common occurrence, are these political events in boxes at professional sporting events. You are off the record, out of the public eye, giving them opportunities to lobby our elected officials. Mm-hmm. And that will happen when you start having these kinds of events that Saudi Arabia has spent $100 million to invest in.
So, all right. Now, I understand lobbying because we're both in DC, and in theory, there are pretty strong rules and laws against this kind of open gift giving. I think is the best way. There's nothing that stops that. There's no kind of regulations or rules. And again, don't laugh at me to my face. Save it for later, because I know that corruption in DC is kind of it's a business model.
Yeah, but the rules are different for federal, state, and local city officials. Federal government has their own regulations, which oftentimes, though, you still see federal lawmakers hosting fundraisers in boxes at Nationals Park or at Capital One Center. That's allowed. That's very well known that happens quite regularly. Mm-hmm. At the state level, you've got 50 different rules. Some states don't care. Some states have even more strict registration and lobbying restrictions than the federal government does. And then you have the city rules. And those are patchwork on top of that. So it's hard to say yes, this would be illegal or not. It would depend on where. But if there's one thing billionaires are good at, it's finding loopholes in these kinds of regulations and exploiting them.
Fair. Tough, but fair. All right. So I get it so far. And then so I put on my my business hat here. And what I've seen now is the valuations of sports teams And I've taken all of the things that we talked about so far into consideration. But then I look at the valuations. And, and my belief is that like these things are probably overvalued, but again, they're a scarce thing. That said, my personal belief and like any analysis I've done on these things is we'll throw that away. The valuations are what somebody's willing to pay for these teams. They're so high now. Is it going to lead us to a road down a path where the only people who can really afford to invest in these things are these oil-rich states and these private investment funds and these regimes that are looking to manufacture a better belief in their governments, that want to do some sports washing? Is that like the only path we have left now?
Left unchecked, maybe. But if the government steps up and starts investigating these kinds of things, starts imposing restrictions on foreign investment from these nations in our sports, then honestly, the valuation might stay at a level in which American billionaires can invest and buy teams. The other thing you have to think about when you're talking about valuations on sports is they are inflated and artificial because they all get to benefit from an antitrust exemption. And when you are the monopoly, you get to dictate what your value is to the market. If we were to get rid of antitrust exemptions and start attacking the media rights and everything else and actually inject competition into the sports industry, that would allow other leagues like the XFL or the UFL to grow and thrive. We could see valuations start to be competitive between teams, and that would be a great thing for, I think, American fandom and the economy.
So you're telling me that there's I love an antitrust story because so you're telling me that the baseball one, Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption is famous, but yep, there's a antitrust consideration and there's like a way that like the NFL, NBA, NHL, they're all blocking out people as well and helping build into this and creating this bubble where, outside investment, foreign investment is taking place.
Yeah, I mean, the antitrust exemptions for all the leagues end up driving up valuations. And you see it like it's been tough for startup leagues to get the kind of airtime on a network that can reach the eyeballs of the American people to grow into those fan bases, because the cost of investing in the big ones right now is so high that there isn't money or airtime on these networks left over for the little guys to come up. And that's a direct result of, what is now about a centuries old antitrust exemption and several others that have kind of been piled on over the years.
Yeah. So we've touched on Live and PGA. And then I wasn't as aware. I mean, I knew a little bit about the Formula One, and I knew a little bit about the MMA. The big one though is why people paid so much attention to the PGA and Live when they have not necessarily paid as much attention to the Grand Prix and MMA, when I think the numbers would lay out that the Formula One and MMA are much more popular at this point than golf in the States.
I think golf got the attention because it was really the first big attempt. It wasn't just a foreign investment fund buying a stake in a team or in a company that owns a team. It was, we are creating a new league and we are competing with the PGA. That raised eyebrows. And then shortly thereafter, when the merger was announced, that was the problem. When it came to the MMA, I mean, globally, MMA is wildly popular and it's a very fast-growing sport. But in the United States, it's still pretty niche. And so it flew under the radar. And then, less than a month ago, it was completed and approved without any kind of review by antitrust authorities, without any kind of review from CFIUS, which is the government agency that monitors foreign investments. Nothing. It just kind of quietly sailed through and got completed. And that is what we are now here. Like, one of the big things I want to talk with you about is that deal and why that's problematic and a sign of things to come. their strategy seems to be, let's pick off these niche sports. Let's make it so that it's just another thing we do. And before you know it, they're going to announce an investment in the Denver Broncos or the Washington Commanders or whatever their team is called in, a few years from now. That's where it's coming, but they know they can't just start there. So they're starting with these niche sports, Formula One, tennis, golf, MMA, and it will get to where they're pretty shortly.
So it's a bit of a Trojan horse is what you're saying. It's like you sneak in, and then by the time anybody notices, it's too late. So, okay. I mean, that all totally makes sense to me. So what do we do? Like, how do we deal with this, right? Because I know you told me earlier that, and I think you gave me a number, but I forgot the number and I didn't write it in my notes. The percentage of people who wouldn't want any of this investment in their teams. What are fans? What is concerned government officials? Like, what do people do about this stuff?
It first starts with transparency, and my fear and belief coming from fresh off the fight in Alexandria on the arena is these foreign investment funds who own stakes in these companies that then ask for taxpayer bailouts to build stadiums or any other number of things that a billionaire wants a bailout for. Government officials need to be saying, if you want any kind of money, and this is not me saying, stadium subsidies are ever a decent idea, because they're not, but if you want money, you have to divest from all your foreign interests from these funds. We are not subsidizing foreign investment funds. That needs to be the bare minimum. But Congress needs to start investigating this and taking it seriously. I mean, to Senator Blumenthal and Senator Johnson's credit at the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, they are very seriously looking into this and have launched investigations. Part of the problem is Saudi Arabia is a foreign country and doesn't have to listen to U.S. Congress's subpoenas. And they have not been cooperating with the investigation to actually look at, what is the long-term strategy and what are the harms that are going to come from this. But they are trying and they are investigating, and they need to keep that investigation up. They need to hold more congressional hearings and bring the American companies that are part of this before Congress to testify. Why? Why are they doing this? And then we eventually, based off of the results of that investigation, need to start passing legislation that regulates or prohibits these kinds of investments. That will take time. That will not be a short-term solution, but it is something that's really important. And you are seeing Congress have a trend right now of going after foreign-owned companies that may pose significant threats or concerns to the American people. I mean, we just passed a ban on TikTok because it has Chinese ownership. Those kinds of things we can start to look into.
So Congress is starting to take this seriously. The Saudi government and the Saudi investment fund has no incentive to cooperate in any way, shape, or form. American businesses can be called in front of Congress, but we've seen that subpoenas now from the federal government have become optional, whereas opposed I would be shitting bricks, I believe would be the term that you would say. How likely are we going to see transparency, or what can we do to make sure that there's transparency? Because again, stuff that I would have never imagined is the way people just sort of thumb their nose at subpoenas from Congress.
Can I answer that question after the election?
Sure, absolutely.
Because
you're a multi-time guest, so you can do whatever you want.
Live the golf tour does a lot of tournaments at Trump golf courses. They did a tournament at the Greenbrier with Jim Justice, who just won his Senate primary. So, depending on the results of the election, the likelihood of Congress and the government taking this threat seriously, say, is different. So I might have to come back.
So what you're trying to tell me is that that one candidate might not necessarily be might be more open to looking the other way than the other is what. Yeah. without getting too far into the weeds.
It is very possible that November's elections dictate how seriously the government takes sports washing, at least for the following 4 years.
I mean, I'd say there's like a lot of crazy things that could happen one way or the other.
Yeah.
So in the short term, then, knowing that this is coming up in about 6 months or so, or less than 6 months now, God help us. Is there anything that our politicians, members of Congress, concerned citizens can do now?
Yes.
Like what can we do in right now? Because I mean, this is again the Trojan. If the Trojan horse strategy is to get in and like have everybody, oh yeah, no, everything's cool, and then all of a sudden just like they bought the Saudis bought Newcastle, all of a sudden they're going to have bought the Miami Dolphins, and I'm going to be like, well, do I follow the NFL anymore? Is it like the answer is probably no, because I don't really follow it that strongly to begin with, but that's a story for a different day.
Well, I will never encourage a fan to boycott their own team. Sports are too important, but they can start holding their ownership to account. DC United is leading on this. The DC United fan base is telling the team, don't engage in Saudi Arabia. Do not go there. We don't want our team's money to be influenced, or our team to be influenced by Saudi money. That's where it can start. But it can go into call your members of Congress, call your senator, call your House member, and tell them, like, take this threat seriously. We don't want foreign investment coming for our local sports. We don't want that level of influence over our fandom and what it could ultimately mean for American politics, both globally and domestically, when that kind of foreign money starts talking. When you start seeing acquisitions or purchases of significant stakes in these companies and teams, members of Congress can send letters, can ask like, hey, why are you doing this? And can express dissatisfaction. And that can oftentimes cause a team to back away from that investment if they know about it. But this is also why we need transparency. We need local reporters who are reporting on their teams here too, saying like, this is not okay. The public deserves to know, especially when we're talking about subsidies. And when we're talking about a billionaire class that is raising ticket prices on fans, raising the cost of a hot dog and a beer at a game, and extracting wealth from the middle class fans of these teams to line their pockets, and then rich foreign investment funds' pockets.
You knew your audience. You worked in the price of a beer. You knew it. You totally nailed it, because I'll always rail against the price of a beer because I find it offensive. That like it's $20 for a Bud Light at some places. Bud Light, yep. Like you couldn't give me 99 Bud Lights for $20, let alone one. All right. So where can people find out more about this and what you're working on?
Yeah, so going to sportsfans.org, our website, we'll have a lot of information, and we are, we'll publish new information as we get it and start really shining a light on all of this. But there are also, all kinds of really good reporters out there at the Post, the Athletic, local news that are covering these kinds of stories and trying to shine a light on it. And we need to be encouraging more of that. And so talk to your local reporters when you catch wind of this kind of stuff, and try to make sure that the public knows when foreign money is being invested in local teams.
Yeah, I in that line too. I always, it's the same thing with gambling and the conflicted nature of just YOLO gambling. I point people to The Guardian, because The Guardian has done some really great stuff, and especially Football Weekly. They did a couple of really great podcasts on the topic that, and I'll try to throw one of those into the show notes if I can find it. But I like a lot of things, again, it creates a conflict, which I think it's probably the intention, where it's like, I can see I could see where the positives, right? The competition come into play, but then I can see the negatives as well, which is like, you start to ignore human rights. You start giving away your nation's wealth because it's flowing out of the state or out of the state, meaning the nation, into another foreign state. So this is an interesting thing to keep an eye on. It's I'm glad to hear people working on it. I'm glad to hear people taking paying attention to this. So Brian, one more. Let's plug you now. Where do people find you on the internet? Because I know that we got sports fans, but we can also find you.
Yeah, I am on Twitter at BL Hess, HESS. And I do retweet a lot of things about politics, sports, and the kind of things that are going on here in DC. That's the best place to find me. And then I am all over the internet. If you just Google me, you'll also find all of my doppelgangers out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of Brian Hesses. Every time I want to tag you in something, I'm like, what the? There's only one Brian Hess to me. Brian, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Dave.
I'm curious what you thought about this conversation and what you think about the idea of sports washing and just these kind of conversations in general. So send me an email, my name at dave@davewakeman.com, and let me know what you thought about the conversation, what you think about the topic, and what you think about these topics in general, because it will help guide me to make sure I'm giving you valuable conversations and new ideas that'll be helpful to you. Make sure you check out my website. It's davewakeman.com. Don't forget the Fans for Life workshop. It is September 4th, 2024 in New York City. We have recreated this for 2024. So I'm going to hit on all the important stuff. Strategy, branding, sales, prospecting, renewals, positioning, everything we can get to help you sell more tickets in 2024 and 2025. It's a challenging environment, so we want to make sure we give you all the tools that we possibly can to help you be successful. So check that out. The link is in the show notes. As I have mentioned here and continue to mention here, I want to thank you for listening and supporting me. I couldn't and wouldn't do this podcast without you. So I'm grateful for all your notes, all your suggestions, all your ideas. But most importantly, I'm thankful for your time. So thank you. Now, you've made it this far to 30, almost 8 minutes. So I know you find the podcast valuable and helpful. Share it with a friend or colleague. This helps me continue to grow the podcast, get great guests, give you ideas that'll be useful for you. Rate it and review it. You can rate it and review it on wherever you get it or get your podcasts. It helps me also get discovered by more people and find more guests. But most importantly, just thank you for being here, and I will talk to you soon. Take it easy.